So what was your first interest?
In cars, I think that when I got my driving license, I started driving, and all my other friends did, and you start driving quicker and quicker, and then far too quick for the roads. I eventually bought myself a Morris Minor, and I started tweaking this, and I entered for a couple of sprints. Then I had a supercharged Morris Minor, which went even quicker. I mean, it sounds crazy now, but it was just a bit faster than an MGA, and nearly as fast as a TR2. When you look back, it's ridiculous, but there you are. And then I realised I would never be a racing driver, although I was keen, and I became more and more into the technical aspect of it.
Now, where was this?
This was in South Africa, in Cape Town in South Africa. And I used to go to all the race meetings. I raced once or twice. As I said, I did some sprints, hill climbs. I just became more and more interested in the cars. And of course we had the Grand Prix in 59 and 60. And I met Sterling Moss, and I said to him I would love to come over to England and work on a Formula One team.
How old were you at that point?
I must have been about 21, 22. And he said, I'll get you a job at BRP. And he gave me a letter for BRP, and I sort of came over to England, charged up to Highgate, and they said, unfortunately, all the vacancies have been taken. So I was most disappointed. I then went off to Bowmaker Lola, who were in Hounslow, saw Reg Parnell, and he said, sorry, we haven't got any vacancies.
Oh, no.
So I looked through Autosport, and I found an advert. Someone wanted a racing mechanic. It was Ian Raby, who had the Empire Racing team, looking after a couple of Formula Juniors. I started with him, and I realised I didn't know a single thing about a racing car.
Whoops.
We ended up in Monte Carlo, and
in 60?
This was beginning of 61.
Okay.
And he gave me the sack because I was no good.
Oh.
So I thought, hang on, I've got to be better than this. So I made inquiries. I said, where does everybody drink? And they said the Tip Top Bar.
Yeah.
So I wandered over to the Tip Top Bar after the Grand Prix, and I said, I'm looking for a job. I'm a very good mechanic. I've had a lot of experience. And I met Jim White, who was the chief mechanic of Lotus. And he said, yeah, well, we are short of one person, but we're going to the Dutch Grand Prix next week, which was rather strange because in 61 it was just 1 week away.
Right. And
they weren't coming back to England. The week after the Dutch Grand Prix, I arrived at Cheshire, and I said, is Jim White here? And he came out, and his words were, it's you, is it? He said, well, we'll put you on a month's trial. I came, and I was completely sort of out of my depth, but fortunately, David Lazenby, who eventually ran the Indy team, took me under his wing, and he realised I was battling, and he helped me in every way. He went out of his way to help me.
That was nice.
And I must say this, out of all the racer mechanics I have ever met, he is by far the best racer mechanic, I would still think, in the world. He is incredible, but there's a lot of imagination.
Right.
And the first race we went to was Spa in 61. The transporter broke down on the way there.
Right.
What happened was the original fuel tank of the TK Bedford was divided into two, so half of it was diesel,
right,
and half of it was racing fuel.
Right.
But of course they forgot to move the pickup, so when it went up the hill, up Dover Hill, the pickup was the wrong place.
Yeah.
And of course, it died, and there was no way you could get it started. So we missed first practice. And when I arrived at Spa, I just couldn't believe it. I was standing where I'd seen photographs. It was incredible.
Yeah.
And that's basically how I started at Lotus.
So your first race meeting with the team, was straight in at Formula One.
Yes, at Spa.
At Spa.
What there was, how it actually worked was that there were two mechanics on each car, and we had a spare.
Right.
And Dick Scamble, who eventually was involved with Cosworth, and Ted Woodley looked after Innes Island's car, and Innes was the number one driver.
Yeah.
And David Lazenby looked after Jim Clark's car. but they were short of a mechanic there. So
Right.
I assisted David Lazenby looking after Jim's Clark, which were the Lotus 21s
Right.
in their day.
And you were sort of doing general stuff. You weren't, not like today, you're specialised. Just anything and everything.
You had to do absolutely everything on the car. You had to build the cars. If you were at a circuit and there was no help, you had engine work to do, you had to do the gearboxes. If you went to a race meeting on your own or with one or two others, you had all the paperwork to do, the carnets.
Really?
You had, although the hotels were booked, you had an expenses. You had your own expenses, which I know sounds crazy today. It was £2.50 a day, which we had to live off. But you had the company expenses, and you had to pay that. So that's how it worked.
So there have been 4 of you for 2 cars, or any more?
There was Jim Enderwhite, who was chief mechanic in
5.
61.
Right.
62 changed a bit. I actually looked after Trevor Taylor's car.
Right.
And David Lazenby, virtually on his own, looked after Jim Clark's car.
Did he?
And Dick Campbell, who was second in command to Jim Enderwhite, sort of oversaw everything.
Right.
And then there was a gearbox mechanic, because we were always in gearbox problems with the cars. Where we had the ZF gearboxes.
Right. Yeah.
They were actually 4-speed boxes made into 5-speed, and to get the 5th gear in, they had to machine all the gears thinner.
Right.
To put them in.
Yeah.
Part of the gearbox, that the main gear was internal splined and fitted over another spline.
Right.
And they kept on moving off. So I mean, there were things like Loctite in those days.
Not.
And what they did, they welded them together. But of course, then they had to machine the welds off, otherwise they wouldn't have fit in. So I mean, there was virtually nothing holding them. And in 1963, when Jim Clark lost the Monaco Grand Prix, this was what happened. One of these welds broke.
Really?
And it jammed in 2 gears at once.
Right.
Whilst in the lead.
Even worse.
Even worse, exactly. In 61, there were still some 2.5 litre cars left over from 1960.
Right.
And we had 2 Lotus 18s, and there was an intercontinental, as it was called, an intercontinental meeting in Silverstone. And it was virtually the first time I went to a Grand Prix. I'd only been there a couple of months, looking after a car on my own.
Right.
Lotus had these square boxes, which everybody has heard of.
Yeah.
And they were, I mean, even nowadays, they're quite difficult to actually get into gear and everything else. Yeah. And I was looking after Jimmy Clark's car. Jim Enderwhite said, well, take the car and put it on the grid. So I got in the car, and this was quite a complicated gear change. Yeah. What it had was a neutral, and then it was forward for first gear. And then when you pulled it back, it went into second, third, fourth and fifth. But you could only select neutral from second gear going forward. In other words, when you came from first, you went right through. That was the principle, but they never worked out like that. And this was the first single-seater I'd ever driven. And I sort of gingerly drove this car onto the grid. But what we used to do, when we went to the Monaco Grand Prix, we used to work outside a place called Aix-la-sur-Mer, which was about 7 miles out of Monte Carlo. And we used to drive the cars on the lower Corniche all the way into Monte Carlo. So there were 3 Formula One cars driving maybe 70, 80 miles an hour on the main roads, going into Monte Carlo and back again.
Brilliant.
And that was incredible. And then, of course, at Spa, we worked at a place called Stavelot, which I think is still part of the Grand Prix. There's one of the bends. And it used to be quite a long circuit in those days. Yeah. And we used to drive around one way up to the pits. Right. And then when we went back to Stavelot, we drove the other way, so we always did a full circuit. Yeah. I think it was 1963. It absolutely teamed down. Right. Chapman and Jimmy and Trevor had disappeared off, and we were going to bring the cars back. And it rained so hard. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. You could not see your hand in front of your face.
Right. Like it does at Spa.
Like it does at Spa, as you say. Any rate, the pair of us actually pulled off.
Did it?
And stopped. Yeah. And it took, you know what the storms are like.
Yeah, of course.
Half an hour they're gone.
Absolutely.
and we waited for the storm to abate, and then we drove the cars on. Obviously, that they had electric starters, onboard starters in those days. And Chapman was standing in the middle of the road, waving his arms. He said, "Where the bloody hell have you been?" And I said, "Well, we couldn't drive, you couldn't see."
Yeah.
He said, "That is the last time a mechanic will ever drive a Formula One car." Of course, the next morning we were back in the cars again
to take them back,
drive around, and then when we went round the other part of the circuit, which was supposed to be a straight, but actually it's a series of very, very fast bends and very bumpy. Which was actually nice about the cars, when you get a sort of 90, 100 miles an hour, all the exhaust noise gets left behind, and you can hear all the timing chains rattling, all the valve gear behind you. And the car was sort of jumping from one side of the circuit down. I thought, bloody hell, this is dangerous. And I said to Jimmy, I said, just come round. I said, something wrong with the car, it's all over the place. He said, no, that's normal. They all he said, so bumpy like that, it's normal, don't worry about it.
Just jumping, can you imagine it? And he was driving it much faster than that.
Driving much faster than that.
And he was
probably getting, they probably did get on for 160 down there. Yeah. I remember going to Po in 1962. We had Lotus 24 with a V8 engine, and we were short of an engine for our second 24, but we had an entry.
Why was that? Because Climax couldn't get the engine
well,
ready?
they just weren't available at the beginning of the season.
Right.
So we decided to put a 4-cylinder engine into a 24. And we had 2 days and 2 nights to do it, virtually. So Chapman got us all together and he said, "Do you think we can do it?" And of course the gauntlet was thrown down. We said yes. So the first night, we worked all day, that's right, and at about 2 in the morning, Jamendra White said, "You actually need some sleep. When you get into the transporter, have 3 hours sleep, and I'll get you up again," which he did. So he worked all the next day, and right through the next night. So now we worked 3 days and 2 nights without sleep, virtually except for a couple of hours. And the big transporter was booked on a ferry, and that couldn't...
No, you couldn't miss it.
We couldn't miss that.
No.
So they got a couple of the lads from Lotus Components to help me finish the car off. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it was done, but nearly done. Hadn't turned the wheel.
No.
The bodywork, they were still busy fitting the bodywork. And we had a little transporter called PMT. The registration was PMT 903, which was a Thames Trader, which had been lengthened.
Right.
And a Zephyr engine put in it. And it was a quick device. You could tow a car, in those days, like with a car in the back, over 80 miles an hour. And what we have towed is with a car in the back and a trailer also at 80 miles an hour.
Wow.
And this is going back to the 60s.
Yeah.
And Chappie said, right, all you've got to do now is put the car in the trailer, is drive down to Dover. I said, you have got to be mad. I said, how do you expect me to drive down to Dover? Oh, no, you'll be all right, Come up to my office. So I went up to his office, and he said, sit down there, and he pulled out a chair, he said, put your feet on there, and he poured me a scotch, which was 2 inches of scotch in a glass. He said, drink that, you'll feel better.
Oh.
So I drank half of this. He said, how do you feel? I said, I feel worse. I said, I'll never drive down there. So he picked up the phoned Pete Arundel. Pete arrived, he lived not so far away, I think probably 3 or 4 miles away. He came and he said, drive Cedric and this car down to Dover, unload the car, push it on the deck, on the normal car deck, and bring the transporter back. Anyway, we were going down the road, and some of the mechanics from Lotus Components were still working on the transporter, fitting the bodywork as we were driving down the road. Jumped off the end of the road. By this time I'd fallen asleep. And we were driving down Walthamstow High Street, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, on the wrong side of the road, doing 60 miles an hour.
Can you imagine it?
And I woke up, and we're coming to a pedestrian crossing. There was an old lady walking across the road, and she put up her hand to stop the transporter, and her hand hit the windscreen. And told us to F off, which he shouldn't have done,
No,
but there you
quite.
go. By that time I'd fallen asleep again. We woke up in Dover and loaded the car on the off the transporter onto the car deck and stepped all the way across, and our big transporter was the other side of it. Picked it up.
Fantastic.
In 63 we went to Silverstone for the International Trophy, and we had a dreadful practice session. We just couldn't get the cars right.
Right.
We really battled, and we were going slower and slower.
Right.
And we went back to the garage we were working at, which wasn't at the circuit. And we did an all-nighter with bump steer checks, corner weights. Of course, we didn't have the sophisticated equipment they have now.
No, of
and
course.
It took forever. If you wanted to get the car on the scales, you actually had to push it off and push it back on every time. When you did bump steer checks, there was no equipment.
No, of course not.
Just by measure, with virtually bits of string and bits of aluminium bar.
Yeah.
And every time you moved it, you had to reset all this.
Sure.
And then we had the second practice on the, I don't know if it was a Saturday or Friday.
Right.
And it was equally as bad. And we went back to the garage, and everybody was a bit despondent, of course. And Tappan said, "I'll tell you what we've got to do is just put all the cars back the way it was." And we'd finished early. We must have finished about 10 o'clock. And we struggled back to the brave old oak. We got into the bar. And we stayed into the bar until 6 in the morning.
Really?
So we
I don't blame
did
you.
one all-nighter on the cars and one all-nighter in the pub. And of course what happened, we actually won. Jimmy Clark won. And what the problem was, I discovered years later, there was one corner they couldn't get right.
Right.
And they concentrated so hard trying to set the car up for this one corner, they were sacrificing the
Everything
other
else.
corners. Yeah. And when we should have said, well, forget about that one, Ben.
And do the other.
And concentrate the others, and that's what happened in the end, because we put the cars back the way they were.
So, now when did you finish with Lotus?
I finished at the British Grand Prix in 64.
And you only... So, in those 3-4 years?
Yeah, I worked on Formula One only.
Formula One only?
Yeah, except we helped build the Indy cars, of course.
Right. From 62?
63.
Right.
63 and 64.
Right.
We built the Indy cars. I mean, it was
You didn't go to Indy?
Well, what happened was we actually had a choice of what you wanted to do. We were asked what we would like to do. And we could have either done Formula One or done Indianapolis and a few of the other meetings. I didn't really fancy being stuck in America for 6 or 8 weeks at a time. And I said, I don't fancy that. I think I'll stick to Formula One. Yeah. And then Chapman said to me, he said, "Would you like to look after Jim Clark's car this year?" This was 63. Right. And I said, yeah, it was just part of the job. And of course, as you know, we won 7 out of 10 Grand Prix.
Not bad going.
1 second, 1 third, and one did not finish.
There you go.
Yeah.
So a bit more reliable than the year before.
A lot more reliable than the
all
year
round.
before. Yes,
absolutely.
Well, it was a massive learning curve in 62 with the 25.
Was it?
Yeah. No, things kept on breaking. Yeah. A lot of gearbox problems and other bits and pieces. The first time the car was out, as you know, that we had a clutch problem, but that was.
And where was that?
Remember? That was at the Dutch Grand Prix in 62. Yeah. We shouldn't have had a problem. It was just, when I think back, it was just lack of mechanical knowledge on our part, which caused that.
It's a bit of a shame.
Which it was a great shame, exactly. But there you go. You learn something new.
Well, that's right. There you go. Absolutely. So, what was it like working with Chapman?
If he liked you, you got on reasonably well with him. If you could produce the goods, you got on very well with him.
Right.
He actually sent me home from a meeting once, and I thought I'd been given the sack, but I hadn't. What happened was that Dick Scammell and I, we were left behind. We were going to Alton Park. It must have been the Gold Cup at Alton Park. And we had a Lotus 24 and two 25s, and we had a brand new 25 which we were just going to test at the meeting, because it was Monza the next weekend, and we didn't have the engine for the 24 until It must have been 7 o'clock the night before practice.
Right.
And we were a long way away.
Yeah.
So we worked on what we normally used to do. We used to wash all the chassis tubes out, the oil ones, with some fairly strong acid to clear all the muck out of it, because the oil and water ran through the chassis tubes. And it was getting late, and I said to Dick, well, what should we do? He said, God knows what we're going to do. I said, well, we just wash them out with water and blow them out. So put the engine in, got the car running, drove all night to arrive at practice at 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, offloaded the car, and lo and behold, the engine ran its bearings.
Oh, I can't believe it.
And Chapman said to me, did you wash the tubes out? And I said, no. He said, get out of my bloody sight.
Oh, no.
Any rate, as it so happened, Trevor Taylor then drove Jimmy Clark's new 25 for Monza. And the radius arm pickups pulled clean out the chassis.
Right.
Now you can imagine this on the banking at Monza.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And the engine went back to Climax, and Climax had found out they'd fitted the wrong bearings into the engine, so it wasn't my fault at all. Any rate, Chapman didn't speak to me for 6 weeks.
Oh.
And then he said something to me, and I said, what happened at Alton Park was a blessing in disguise. And he said, don't I know it? And from that day on, I couldn't do anything wrong.
There you go. It's funny, isn't it? Yeah. Just the way he was.
Yeah.
Driver-wise, who did you work with in those...
In those days?
Yeah, in those Formula One, so obviously Jim Clark.
Jim Clark, Innes Island.
Right.
Pete Arundel and Mike Spence.
And what was
Pedro Rodriguez, he drove for us in Mexico.
What was he like?
Well, he didn't speak, I don't think he spoke English.
Oh, really?
You know, he just had that one race. And we broke a timing chain in Mexico City, and on his car, we had 3 cars.
Yeah.
And there was all panic. I can't remember much about it, but I know we did an all-nighter. Yeah. We actually worked at the circuit, which was most unusual in those days.
Right.
Pedro Rodriguez's father, I don't know what he was involved with, but something a bit devious.
Was it?
But he brought loads of spotlights, and we sort of worked all night.
Brilliant.
And we managed to... Prior to that, which was also quite interesting, when we were at Watkins Glen, which must have been 2 weeks before, I think, or a week before.
This was 63?
63. We also had engine trouble. I had to set the valve timing of the engine. And we all worked in this one big shed. And I was battling because the figures, I couldn't interpret. All we had was a spec sheet.
Right.
And I couldn't interpret what the spec sheet said. And I had a vague idea. In the same big shed, the BRM mechanics were working. And they were watching me for 2 days, and when they'd finished their work, Willie Southgate was the engine bloke.
Right.
He wandered over to me, he said, let me give you a hand, and he set the valve timing up on this Climax.
That's nice of him.
Well, it was like that in those days.
Absolutely.
Everybody borrowed from everybody else, and everybody helped everybody else. It was great fun.
Brilliant.
In the beginning of '64, we went to Syracuse for the Grand Prix.
Right.
We took 2 cars, and there were 2 drivers, obviously, and the small transporter. I decided to take a new lad who'd started there by the name of Willie Coo, because we got on well together. Just as we were about to leave, Chapman ran over. He said, when you get there, tell the organisers that Jim Clark can't come.
Right.
You know, and my God, what...
It's for the Grand Prix?
No, it wasn't. I mean, there were a lot of races besides...
Of course, yeah, non-championship stuff.
Yeah, non-championship race. And of course, Jim Clark was world champion. Everybody was dying to see him. And he said, also, make sure you bring back the start money with you. It'll be in cash, in lira.
Oh, no. Here we go.
So we trundled off down to Syracuse. Terribly sorry, Jim Clark's not coming, but Mike Spencer's coming. I don't know what they said, but they weren't exactly happy with us, as you can imagine. And it was quite interesting. We were busy balancing wheels, because we had to do it ourselves, because Dunlops weren't there. Maston Gregory wandered over for a chat. And he was telling us a story that when he was there last year, they were driving the front engine cars.
Right.
And Phil Hill was in front of him in the Ferrari. And they're like walls. And he noticed that Phil Hill had knocked one of the spinners on the wall, and the wheel was starting to come loose.
Right.
So he started to point, so Phil Hill could see in his mirrors. Anyway, Phil didn't pay any attention, so he tried to overtake Phil Hill and point and tell him. And Phil Hill wouldn't let him past. Eventually, Phil Hill realised what the problem was, and after the race, he said to Phil, he said, "I didn't want to pass you. I just wanted to tell you the wheel was falling off." At any rate, when we'd finished there, we collected the start money in lira, which was a lot of lira.
Yeah.
And we drove back. The two of us drove non-stop. And because of the hills, we went across the ferry to Messina, drove down to the toe of Italy, up the Adriatic, into Switzerland, into France, and then across on the ferry, and we got within half a mile of the factory and we ran out of petrol, but we eventually got back.
I mean, how long a drive was that, saying that? That's a huge drive.
You know, and it must have taken us 2 days or something.
Because there's no auto routes or anything
it was all little roads.
B roads.
Yeah, B roads as it were in those days, yeah. And because we were on such a high, by the time I got back, that night I couldn't sleep at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Too wide awake.
Too wide awake.
Absolutely, yeah. So what about, who was your favourite, who was the best, who was your favourite driver?
Trevor
really?
Taylor. Oh, he was great fun.
Was he a nice guy?
Oh, we used to have a social scene that was beyond belief. He didn't sort of mix with Jimmy and Colin Chapman a lot, and he used to spend most of his time with us. Him, Bruce McLaren, we used to spend a lot of time with.
Right, yeah.
He was great fun. Tony Maggs, of course, and one of the other mechanics, Derek Wild, and myself, or actually most of our spare time we used to spend with the Maggses and the McLarens,
right?
Because that was great, it was good fun, as I said. Tony Maggs' wife was always up to something, and so it was good.
Excellent.
Yeah, and there's a story which is actually incredible, that when we were at Sunfoot in '63. We were going to a do afterwards, and we didn't have a clean shirt. And Patty McLaren washed our shirts for us. God. I mean, she worked. I mean, her husband drove for another team.
Exactly.
And
she cleaned your shirts.
And Bruce said, "What are you doing it for?" She said, "Well, we haven't got clean shirt. I haven't got clean shirt. What do you expect me to do?"
God, that's nice, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, so you finished at Lotus in '64.
Yes.
At the end of the year.
No, as I said earlier on, at the British Grand Prix.
Right. Can I ask you why?
Well, yeah, I was on the throes of getting married and everything else, and there didn't seem to be that challenge anymore. I mean, we would actually won a world championship, and I needed another goal, and I wouldn't say I lost interest, but I lost probably about 5% of my dedication.
Did you?
Yeah, because I wanted something else to aim at, something different. And as I said, I was in the throes of getting married, so I decided I'd actually had enough. Yeah.
So what did you go off and do after that?
Well, actually, I still got involved in motor racing. I was involved with Ian Walker.
Right.
For a while, and
what sort of building cars or?
We were building a Lands, special Lands. There was special equipment to Lands.
Right.
And then I drifted out of motor racing, and then I worked for Ulf Norinder for a year in the T70s, which was good fun, and Formula 5.
Nice cars.
Yeah,
T70s.
Oh, incredible cars.
Great looking car.
And then I built my own sports car. There was an FF1.
This was still over here?
Yes.
In England?
Yeah, there was a series based around Firestone tyres, FF100 tyres. The series was called FF100. You had to have an engine out of a production car under 1300cc.
Right.
And I designed and built my own car.
Right.
Won quite a few races. Came second in the championship the first year.
When was that?
That must have been, either 69 or 70.
Right. Yeah.
And then I lost a lot of money doing it, of course.
Yeah.
And I said, I never want to see a racing car as long as I live.
Yeah.
I didn't get involved. I didn't even pick up a motor racing magazine. And then a friend of mine phoned me up and he said, I've just got my helicopter license. Would you like to go to the Grand Prix this was 1980.
All right.
So I said, yeah, if you pick me up somewhere. I never expected him to turn up, but he did. We went to the British Grand Prix. And I thought I could actually handle it without being addicted to it.
Yeah.
Because I was addicted before. And then in 1982 I bought a Lotus 23 which I restored, and we raced that quite successfully.
Right. Who was driving it?
Chris Alford.
Right. He's still around.
He's actually raced the 25 quite a few times.
Yeah.
In fact, he raced the car in South Africa recently. And then what else I acquired after that? I got the 24. Then I bought an engine in America, a V8 engine in America, and I had some of the remains of 25 R5, which was crashed by Trevor Taylor at Spa, which was just thrown out the scrap.
In 63?
63.
Yes.
He had a marshal's post, if you remember.
Yeah.
And
so where had that car been, or the remains of it been all that time?
I had some of the remains.
Right.
The rest was just pure scrap. But I had some pieces. I just kept it as souvenirs.
Yeah.
I had some suspension bits. I'd probably 1/3 of the monocoque.
Right.
So when I found an engine in America.
And when would that have been?
This must have been 1986, I think.
Right.
I put it together. I didn't have any drawings. I couldn't get any drawings, so
was it all from memory?
I had to draw. I spent a year drawing
Ooh.
what I did from memory, and then tried to see if it would actually fit, and in photographs, and I eventually got it right.
Right.
When we rebuilt the monocoque, and I sat there for the first time. I said, there's something wrong. We've made a mistake somewhere. It just fell too short from what I remembered.
Right.
What I did have is that Team Lotus did actually release Chapman's first GA, which is a General Assembly.
Right.
Which was just like a sketch. And I tried to scale it up, get through all the measurements. And I went over and over and over again, and it took me, looking at these drawings, 2 days to realise where the mistake was. That we'd actually made the monocoque, the actual seat part of the cockpit of the monocoque, an inch too short, and the engine bay an inch too long.
Oh, I see.
So we had to...
So you had the right length in total.
And the wheelbase was right, but so we had to unrivet all this and start again.
Yeah.
And get it right.
And when did you finish it then?
It took us a couple of years.
Did it?
Yeah. It was good fun doing it.
Yeah.
It was great.
And people love seeing it.
Oh yeah. And
it's a proper job.
Oh yeah. I enjoy having it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So how many of those are around? Do we know?
Of the 25.
How many were made initially anyway? Oh, in total.
I'll have to look in the book. I suppose 7 or 8.
Right. Yeah. Are they still around?
33. The only other 20. Yeah, there are 2 25s around. One's in the Donington Museum.
Yes, seen that one.
And the other one belonged to Dawson Damer, but I imagine still belongs to his family.
Oh yes. Yeah.
Rob's Lamptow's got a 33, and I think there's a 33 in Switzerland, or a 25 in Switzerland, which is in private hands, which no one will ever see.
Really?
And there's 33 in the Schlump Museum.
Oh, that's right.
And then there's another one in a museum here, in another museum in England.
Right. Yeah. But none of those are runners.
No.
Not even the Donington one.
No, that doesn't run. I mean, it can't run. When I had a good look at it, you'd have to start again to make it into a runner. Yeah.
It's just... Oh.
I mean, nothing actually fits properly.
No.
You'd actually have to take the monocoque apart to
make it work. Yeah. So I must ask you, what was Jim Clark like to work with?
He was a very shy person. He never quite got the hang of... He couldn't understand why people made such a fuss of him, because he didn't, he just thought he was not doing. He wasn't doing anything so really exciting.
So out of the ordinary.
Out of the ordinary.
Yeah.
And as a passenger car, he was very, very nervous. Or even at like 50 or 60 miles an hour. When we were at Rouen, I think it was either 62 or 60, I can't remember. Trevor was driving the car, Jimmy was sitting next to him, and I was sitting in the back. And he was biting his fingernails.
Because he didn't like...
Because it was just...
Do you think it was just because he wasn't in control, sort of thing? Or
it was just the nature of the
beast. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
So what was your last race?
It was a British Grand Prix in 64.
64.
Which Jim Clark won. He had the first part, he and Graham Hill were nose to tail practically all the way.
Right.
But during practice, Chapman got Jackie Stewart to have a run in the spare car.
Right. And Jackie was at BRM at that point?
No, he was driving Formula Junior.
Right.
I mean, I'd heard of him, but he was...
Yeah, that was... as far as it goes.
Like an up-and-coming star, but he had no...
Yeah.
He was just another driver as far as I was concerned at the time. So he got in the car, and he did a few laps, came back, and he said to me, I'm terribly sorry. He said, I've knocked every corner of this car. He said, I cannot get to grips with a car having so little power. And he said, I'm terribly sorry, I'm terribly sorry. And for years afterwards, he was apologising to me for this car. Of course, it was history.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and that was my swan song. I left Lotus, and great days, greatest days of my life.
Good.
I was very lucky, in fact, to have been part of it. We didn't get paid much money. I started off with £12.50 a week, ending up with £17.50 a week. We got 10% of the prize money.
Right.
But what it was that it was divided up between the Indy team and us, and the Indy team's prize money was also all divided up.
Yeah.
And Chapman said to us, he said, if we won the World Championship 63, he would buy us all a Mini.
A Mini?
Yeah, the whole team, including the Indy team.
Okay.
And Ford's heard about this, and they went stark raving mad. And they said, no, you don't. And we each got a brand new Cortina GT for a present.
Even better.
Yeah.
That was nice.
I don't know where they are now, but I kept mine for 6 weeks and sold it.
Okay. How many? I mean, saying that, how many must have you bought? A dozen? Or were given?
No, I
not even as many as that.
Not probably about 8 or 9. That's about how many there were on the team.
Exactly.
But at the time, I had an Alfa Romeo Giulietta TI.
Right.
And we went. It was a rare thing to go testing with Lotus because we never had the time or the money or anything. And we went up to Silverstone to go testing with a Formula One car.
Right.
And one of the Lotus Cortinas. I lived in northwest London, and things like that, I should just drive up there, not go to Cheshire and then go back up.
Just go straight to
select my own car. And they were trying to sort the Cortina out, and they had problems with it. In fact, that there are stories about Chapman sitting at the back of the Cortina to try and actually weigh it down.
Yeah.
And he said to Jim Clark, I can't understand what angles are you driving because it doesn't seem right. And I don't know if you've ever read Mark Donohue's book, have you?
No.
He's done something called the friction circle.
Yeah.
And that's what Jimmy was doing without thinking.
Right.
It's quite complicated, but it was just so natural to him because he wasn't taking the normal lines. Chapman came over to me, he said, do you think I have to drive in your Alpha? I said, yeah, you can have a drive around in it. And he went driving. He came back, he said, you know what, that's the worst car I've ever driven in my life.
But
I didn't think so. It was a bad car.
No.
I mean, the rear suspension didn't fall apart and it just kept on going.
Yeah.
And it was well engineered. But he said it was terrible. But there you go.